Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hope you've been enjoying the set as much as I have. We're kind of covering the white flyer strategy this week. So Azorius leans quite heavily into the flying strategy, similar to a way that you can kind of approach doing the Orsov strategy, except for because you have bounce instead of removal, it's a little bit harder to do the strictly attrition thing, and a lot of times you're just looking to out-tempo your opponent with flyers. And it's kind of an old boomer strategy, clog up the ground and win in the air. And but it's worked relatively well for me. I have been able to get a no rares required trophy in the archetype, and I do think it's another underdrafted space. So welcome to episode 82 of No Rares Required, my weekly podcast or draft guide focused on limited or draft, and we dive into each color pair or archetype. Apparently this year, this set, what I've been doing is doing 2 each week. So this week, the number of votes on YouTube here was Azorius, and the theme for MTG Arena was Take a Break. And that's because you're really trying to cast spells on your opponent's turn and not on your turn. So you're supposed to take a break on your turn. And I think that it's okay, but I also think that it's a bit of a trap. There's definitely some cards that you're not really happy to have that fit into that strategy. But you do also have some payoffs like the Emergent Haunting and the Prairie Dogs that work quite well within that strategy. So as always, here is my draft skeleton consisting of 17 commons, 5 uncommons, and 1 rare or mythic. Again, if I can build a strategy that's dependent on commons and uncommons, then I have a higher chance that I'll be able to draft the strategy consistently on Arena. And for those who are listening audio only, the main takeaways are similar to the Dimir and Izzet space, and most of the times that I'm playing blue, I've had the most success treating the blue archetypes as spellslinger archetypes with a very low creature count. So having a high number of spells lets me focus on answering my opponent's plays on their turn if I do want to do that. And you can like gain the benefit of the Geyser Drake at common, and which makes your spells cheaper on the when you're playing them on your opponent's turn. And then Prairie Dog can run away with a game if you're not casting spells on your turn. So as I mentioned, blue doesn't have great removal, but it does have counter spells, so you can kind of look to disrupt your opponent's plays that way. And then white-blue has a lot of great flyers to push damage through in the air, like Holy Cow, Marauding Sphinx, and Sterling Supplier. And since we aren't blocking most of the time with our flyers, cards that are kind of not usually great to pick up, like Ariet's Lullaby, become quite a bit more important. And then Take Up the Shield, also, if we're trading blows and not blocking with our opponent, the life gain off of Take Up the Shield can really help us win that race. So with the larger picture in mind, let's dive into the 17 lands data and cover the traps to avoid, as well as when I think you should look to take each card during a draft. So first up, I like to calculate the total wins created. I do this by taking the average of the game's played win rate and the game in hand win rate on a third-party tracking website called 17 Lands. And then I subtract the average win rate of all of the users in the archetype and multiply it by the number of games played. And what, again, this allows me to do is look at the cards that are most positively affecting the archetype. And so just to read down the list really quickly here, we've got Phantom Interference, Holy Cow, Mystical Tether, Lassoed by the Law, Marauding Sphinx, Take Up the Shield, Prairie Dog, Getaway Glamour, Journey to Nowhere, Stoic Sphinx, Repulse, Dust Animus, Essence Capture, Geyser Drake, Lonely Oreo, and Lone Shark. So we can repeat this process again for the total wins destroyed, kind of do the reverse, see which cards are hurting the archetype the most for the most amount of people. And what we've got here for the top 3 traps to avoid are Razzle Dazzler, which is the 1/2 for 1 and a blue. Whenever you cast your second spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it can't be blocked this turn. The problem with this is that this wants you to be doing 2 spells on your turn instead of doing spells on your opponent's turn so that you can make this unblockable. So it's much more of a blue-red card than it is a white-blue card. Spring Splasher, again, this one in every blue archetype, even in Dimir, where you actually care about the crimes, this card just gets outclassed very quickly. So you get a 2/1 for 1 and a blue that gives a creature, whenever it attacks target creature your opponent controls, gets -3/-0 until end of turn. Excuse me. And so this it does trigger a crime when you're attacking with it. White blue doesn't really care about committing crimes, and even in Dimir, like I mentioned, this was one of the top 3 trap cards. And then Inventive Wingsmith is kind of the card that I was talking about with, like, there are a couple of cards that look like they would fit into the archetype and fit the strategy. So at the beginning of your instep, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand, you get a flying counter on your 2/4 for 2 and a white. And so this is strictly with the white-blue space in mind. And even here in the archetype where it should be its best, it is still not a very good card. And part of it is just like it doesn't have flying until you do get it to have flying, and then even as a 2/4 flyer isn't really that impressive for 3. And it's not particularly good if they bounce it, because then you have to like re-trigger it again. So generally the cards that generally you want to have a pretty good payoff if you're going to be deciding to skip your turn from playing spells. So the next up, what I like to do is I take those wins created, and then I divide them by the number of times that the card was picked. And what this does is kind of bring everything a little bit more onto an even level, because the rares are going to be picked less often than the uncommons and commons. And then I graph it against the average taken at, or ATA, and fit the data with a logarithmic regression. And after doing that, I calculate the distance of the card to the fitted line, which, thanks to Carl, aka 2Duck Cubed, we'll call value over replacement, because you'll notice that the rares tend to be stronger as well. So it kind of gives you an optimal curve to compare things to. And then calculating the distance to that curve, you can kind of see how good the card is at a different time point within the draft and by how much. So the higher the value of a replacement, the more important the card. And top of the list here, we've got Fractured Identity, which is the 3 white and a blue for sorcery, exile target non-land permanent, and then each player other than its controller creates a token that's a copy of it. Particularly good to hit on some of the busted bombs in the set. Bonnie Paul comes to mind. And but even if you're just hitting like a Cactarantula with this, being able to remove your opponent's thing and then also get a copy of your own is quite good. Mana Drain is also another one that's a spectacular bomb in blue. Being able to counter target spell of your opponents for double pip blue, and then at the beginning of the next turn you get to add colorless mana equal to the spell's mana value. So you can use this as a tempo play to just completely leave your opponent in the dust. And then we've got Stoic Sphinx, which is a 5/3 flash flyer for 2 double pip blue. Pretty much when you're in blue, Stoic Sphinx is a good one to look for, and I'm happy to open it up, pack one, pick one. Especially because if you don't cast a spell, it has hexproof. And sometimes just not casting spells, which this archetype wants to do anyway, means that they can't touch this flyer, and a 5 damage a turn is a pretty fast clock indeed. And then value over replacement for picks 2.5 through 5. And this is where, if you don't have the pack one pick ones, these are also decent ones to take early, and kind of the reasons to be in the archetype. And top of the list here, we've got Assimilation Aegis, and this is the kind of signpost rare, or mythic, I should say. You get an artifact that exiles, so it's one of the 7 O-rings in the set. And then you get to equip it for 2 to make your creature that's equipped into the copy of the creature that was exiled with the Assimilation Aegis. So you can hit, I've lost to this, especially when they hit something like a 5-costed flyer, like a Sterling Supplier. Just being able to turn all of the 1/1 tokens into these like legitimate threats makes the Assimilation Aegis pretty good. And then we've got the 3 Steps Ahead, which is another one that I look to take early, and happy to do like a pack one pick one if I don't have my number, my first tier of picks. And because the versatility of this card is pretty awesome, right? It's not quite at the level of Epiphany, but like it kind of feels like Epiphany at home. You get a cancel as the floor, and then you can use it to draw 2 cards and discard a card, or create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature that you control. So if you do have a Stoic Sphinx, you can get another one for 4 mana, as well as counter your opponent's play. And yeah, you can do some really crazy things where you just outvalue your opponent with the 3 Steps Ahead. And then Marauding Sphinx is another one that I'm happy to take early, and a good reason to be in blue. The 3/5 flyer and the fact that it has vigilance means that you're able to pressure in the air quite effectively, and then it blocks really well, and it has ward 2. so it's difficult for your opponent to remove. And then if you are committing a crime, which again this archetype doesn't do particularly well, but it triggers a Surveil 2 every time that you commit a crime, once each turn. So this can then help you dig to your additional threats. And then we can value over replacement for picks 5 through 8. This is typically where you see your undervalued uncommons and the majority of your commons that you're going to look to fill out the archetype once you know that you are in Azorius. And so, again, we see this list is incredibly long, kind of a signature for this set. And but the top 3 are Detention Sphere, which is 1 a white and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you exile things, so it's another one of those O-rings. And Azorius can have a ton. Like I said, there are 7 in the set, and so a lot of enchantment removal can be probably is your better way of your white-based removal, and your white-blue removal in enchantments is a particularly handy way to go in the Azorius archetype, because the blue is only really bringing the bounce spells. And then Essence Capture is a counter spell that puts a +1/+1 counter on to one of your creatures, and if it's one of your creatures has flying, it's particularly good. And so I've really liked the Essence Capture. And I do think that one's relatively undervalued, so I'm surprised to see it going so late in a draft. And then we've got a common, which is a little bit more what we would expect to see. The Holy Cow feels like it's right in the right spot. And you get a 2/2 flying flash, and you gain 2 life and scry 1 when it enters the battlefield. And this one works particularly well for not casting your spells on your turn. So if you turn 2 Prairie Dog, turn 3 you pass, and then play the Holy Cow on their turn, giving you the +1/+1 counter on Prairie Dog, and it fits perfectly into that strategy. Same with the Emergent Haunting. And then value over replacement is picks 8 and onward, and these are the cards that you can look to wheel or see a second time. And this again is a good way to judge whether or not the archetype is underdrafted or overdrafted. And we see over 10 as well here, so is another underdrafted space. And top of the list here for the cards that I look to wheel is Phantom Interference, which is the Quench. And you can also use it as a sort of more expensive flash flyer too, than the Holy Cow, right? So for 4, you can do a 2/2 white flying token with flying, or 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. And if your quenches kind of become not relevant later in the game, is a nice option. And then the real payoff, though, and the real thing that I love about the Azorius space is Geyser Drake. And I've been a big fan of Wind Drake for many years, and they have gone and made it 3 toughness instead of 2, and it makes your spells that you're casting on your opponent's turn cost 1 less to cast. And since we're looking to use a lot of our blue bounce, Holy Cows cost 1 less to cast too, it's not just non-creature spells. The Geyser Drake really enables some really cool stuff that you can do on your opponent's turn. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Ariet's Lullaby is better in this archetype than it is in most white archetypes, because you aren't really looking to block, and so your opponents are going to be attacking into you. And if you are blocking, you're blocking with something like Armored Armadillo or the Canyon Crab that isn't really threatening them or punishing them. And so if we're attacking in the air, in general, we've seen this before. Cards that affect tapped creatures do better if you're doing evasive threats where you're not blocking and you're turning your creatures left, because then your opponent is also doing that. If you're beating them down on the ground, then they can't afford to attack into you, and they don't have tapped creatures, and then this card becomes a dead card. So in Azorius, it's a great card, and the only downside is that it is a sorcery, and you won't be able to play it on their turn. So I hope that was helpful, and next week I'll be covering the last 2 archetypes, Gruul and Boros. And again, these guides do take a fair amount of time to put together each week, so thank you to those who take the time to click like and subscribe. I do appreciate it, and I will, as it has now become the tradition, include the updated version of this draft guide in the description of the video, which will cover all of the archetypes, not just Azorius. So if you're curious how things have changed throughout the weeks, that will be available. And then if you are also wanting to look, I do post it in my Discord every week. And we also do deck techs and co-op drafts there, so we've got a nice little Magic the Gathering community. And then I also stream on Twitch at 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. 2 p.m. Pacific and 5 p.m. Eastern. Stumbling over my words a little bit today, I apologize. And Also, to mention my free cash open, where we compete for actual cash prizes in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, will be on June 1st, which is a Saturday. So if you'd like to join, the information for that and the registration is in my Discord as well. So special thanks again to my YouTube members, Twitch subscribers, and Patreons. I really appreciate all of those who are helping my dream come true by financially supporting me. And good luck with your games and future trophies, and I'll see you next week for the final 2 archetypes.